Russia and China. They've revealed a desire to challenge, to disrupt the Western-led order. They both have the capacity to do so, especially in coordination with each other. Most of today's great powers are nuclear powers. And to my mind, the risk of mutually assured destruction is channeling conflict away from the battlefield and into the theater of economics, where confrontation isn't existential, but it's not costless.
Daleep Singh served 2 tours of duty as Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics under the Biden administration. Now he is Vice Chair, Chief Global Economist and Head of Global Macroeconomic Research at the Fixed Income Managers PGIM. He's a global expert in economic statecraft, which is the use of economic policy instruments to achieve foreign policy objectives, such as using foreign aid, sanctions and trade agreements to influence another country's behaviour. Daleep, thanks for joining us today. We live in a time when Russia and China are trying to reshape the global economic order. The future looks set to be a time of intense geopolitical competition. How important is economic statecraft in these times?
Good to be with you, Clifford. You're right. The post-Cold War unipolar moment is over. It's not coming back anytime soon. Both Russia and China, they've revealed a desire to challenge, to disrupt the Western-led order. They both have the capacity to do so, especially in coordination with each other. The US and its allies are pushing back, but there's a large and growing number of geopolitical swing states that are increasingly hedging their bets, trying to carve out a non-aligned path. So that's a geopolitical backdrop with much more uncertainty, much less scope for cross-border cooperation to solve cross-border risks, and sadly, much more likelihood of conflict. Economic tools, I should say, how do they fit into this picture? Well, most of today's great powers are nuclear powers. And to my mind, the risk of mutually assured destruction is channeling conflict, direct conflict between great powers, away from the battlefield and into the theater of economics, where confrontation isn't existential, but it's not costless.
One of the words you hear within this context, I suppose one of the main weapons in global conflict right now is critical minerals and rare earths. And with China clamping down on critical minerals, the US and Europe seem vulnerable. What steps can the US and its allies take to build supply chains without this overdependence on China?
Well, it's not just critical minerals. Over the course of decades, China has amassed dominant scale in a range of strategic sectors. Ships, cars, drones, batteries, pharmaceuticals, solar panels, electrolyzers. China has about 1/3 of global manufacturing in terms of value added. That's double the share of the US. What can the US do? What can the West do? Number one, it's increased productive capacity. That's what every Western country is trying to do, but of course there are constraints because of our fiscal burdens. The second step, therefore, is really important. We have to partner together. I think we have to, for countries that are playing by the same rules, we have to give access to each other's productive capacity and our purchasing power. And the last step is, for countries that are not playing by the same rules, for the countries that are flooding the market and distorting competition, we will have to collectively raise barriers, regrettably, not because we want to punish China, but because we need to change the terms of competition back towards the capacity to innovate, the capacity to attract talent, the capacity to form alliances. If those are the terms of competition, we'll be okay. But right now, we're in a very vulnerable situation with critical minerals and a range of other strategic goods.
Another part of this whole debate has been talk about de-dollarization and about countries shifting to the renminbi, the Chinese currency. But how realistic is this, given that the capital controls that China imposes on the yuan? Is this political or is it based on real economics?
I don't think it's realistic. Putting your savings into a country requires trust, and trust is earned with protections, rule of law, an independent central bank, as you mentioned, free capital flows so you can take your money out when you want to. And it appears that China's leadership is unwilling to make those kinds of market-oriented reforms, I think because it gives up control to market forces. And so until and unless China is willing to make those reforms, I think the renminbi is going to punch well below China's weight in the global economy.
Staying with China, we've seen recently Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has come out with some very strong language on trade with China. The word decoupling has been mentioned. We haven't heard that for a while. He also recently described Li Chang'an, China's top trade negotiator, as unhinged. These are kind of unprecedented times in so many ways. How would you characterize trade relations between the US and China right now? And is a lot of this posturing, or is there a deeper change in relations going on?
As you know, we're nearing a potential leaders summit between President Trump and President Xi at the end of this month in Seoul at APEC. And so what we're seeing right now, this rhetoric that you referenced, it's geopolitical theater. President Trump and President Xi, both sides, are flexing their muscles, not to break each other, but to enter talks from a position of strength. Drama is kind of the choreography that you need to claim credit later for striking a deal. But I think both sides actually do want a truce in the relationship. For President Trump, I think he really values the symbolism. He wants a Nixon goes to China moment. He wants to win the Nobel Prize. And I think he does realize, I think he is deep down a pragmatic president. And I think he does understand he doesn't hold all the cards with China. In fact, he doesn't hold most of the cards. And for China, I think President Xi, I think he recognizes he also needs a truce because China is still struggling under the weight of its own problems, its debt burden, its deflation problem, its ongoing deleveraging campaign, the demographics in the country. And so it doesn't want to have a further hit to economic growth from an uncontrolled escalation with the United States. It would much rather play the long game and keep acquiring market share, global market scale in the strategic sectors we just talked about. So look, I think we'll probably end up in a truce that puts a floor under the risk in the relationship after this summit, but the fundamental problems will not be solved. We still have two very different, almost incompatible economic models between China and the West. And that's going to be an ongoing source of friction. The challenge is how to manage it responsibly so it doesn't take down the two largest economies in the world and the rest of the global economy with it.
One of the tools that have been at the center of so much of the China-US debate, and also because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has been sanctions. This idea of the choke point of using economic tools to further your aims. How successful have sanctions been in managing conflict? And how would you advise governments to handle sanctions? Because they can be a hard sell among the general populace.
Yeah. I grew up in the private sector and financial markets, trying to figure out how do you make markets function well for the benefit of the people who participate in that economy. And unfortunately, because we're in the world that we discussed earlier, a world that's highly contested, highly fragmented, highly uncertain, sanctions have become the policy tool of first resort. When I was asked to design sanctions against Russia, what I had to do was take everything I knew about how markets function well and flip that logic on its head to essentially impose economic pain to change the calculus of an autocrat like Putin, who's terrorizing 45 million innocent people. So how well are they working? By themselves, sanctions are not an effective strategy. Okay, they're kind of like antibiotics. The more you use them, the more resistance you build up. And you play a cat and mouse game. And ultimately, you're not going to dissuade an autocrat like Putin from pulling out his troops when he's really after a 19th century land grab. But if you use sanctions in conjunction with a military strategy, a diplomatic strategy, then together you have a chance of changing the calculus of an autocrat. In other words, convincing them that the cost of continuing a war, an illegal war, a reckless war, a catastrophic war like the one Russia's waged in Ukraine, that is not worth it. But you have to have staying power, you have to have a coalition, and you have to understand the limits. I worry quite a bit about a race to the bottom in the use of sanctions. And I have been on the record advocating for a doctrine of economic statecraft. Much like we have a doctrine for the use of military force, I think we need a Geneva Convention type of doctrine to limit the use of economic weaponry. Otherwise, we're going to break the bonds in the global economy, end up in autarky, and potentially head for a catastrophic outcome in terms of the consequences for the people all over the world.
So against this backdrop, maybe to look at the situation in the United States in a domestic way, against the background of the way things are developing with sanctions internationally, President Trump's erratic trade policy, we've got fiscal deficits, we have the shutdown, and then, of course, we have threats to the Fed's independence, which all of this is putting pressure on the unit of international commerce, the greenback. It's slumped 7%, I think, on a trade-weighted basis since January, and it's had its worst start to the year since 1973. How do you see the situation with the dollar developing against the backdrop of this entire situation?
Your numbers are right. The dollar's had its worst year since 1973. But if you look at the measures that indicate how widely a currency is used, to spend money, to save money, or to borrow money, on those measures, the dollar is still dominant. Its market share, its global market share, is still 3 times greater than the closest competitor, the euro, 20 times greater than the renminbi. Why is it so dominant? Well, I mean, the dollar is kind of like the Microsoft operating system of finance. It has incredibly powerful network effects. There's also not an alternative that has comparable depth and liquidity, not among sovereign issuers of currencies, not among digital assets, not even gold. But that's not a reason for complacency. I mean, I think the premise of your question is right. The dollar's value is drifting lower. And, we have to go back to the features, the institutional strengths that gave the dollar its primacy in the first place, and recognize many people are asking questions. Are those strengths still intact? Rule of law, due process, checks and balances, a professional civil service, independent institutions, a free press. Many people are asking all over the world, can you still trust America as a reliable and predictable partner? Many parents are wondering, should I send my children to study in the US? And so one of America's superpowers, the ability to attract the best talent and ideas from across the world. The fact that many people are questioning whether those strengths are still intact is itself a big problem for the dollar, because the dollar, like any other network, it has psychological tipping points, and networks lose value slowly and then suddenly. So I think as an ex-American policymaker, we should take none of this for granted. This is an exorbitant privilege that allows us to borrow at far cheaper levels than any other country. It allows America to absorb shocks like no other. It allows America to deliver shocks like no other country. So it's time to shore up those strengths. And I think economic tools, the most important message I would leave with you is our economic tools should be used to attract and inspire and to create, not just to punish and to coerce. We need to strike a better balance.
Inspire and create. Well, it's the positive message we'll take away from this today. Daleep Singh, former US Deputy National Security Advisor and Chief Global Economist at PGIM Fixed Income Managers. Thanks for taking time to talking to us today.
Pleasure.